We'll get started fairly shortly. We'll just give a few moments for anybody who's going to join at the last minute. Well, good morning and welcome back for session 5 of this 10-session study on the meaning of what the original evangelists wanted us to hear in the Christmas stories. And this will be the last talk that I give on aspects of Matthew's gospel. And I wrap it up with looking at the arrival of the wise men. One of the things I have always loved the most in my winter travels is the opportunity to be in a place like San Juan, Puerto Rico on the 6th of January, the Feast of the Epiphany. Much like the French-Canadian culture where I grew up, they really keep Epiphany as Le Petit Noël, but because the climate there is so different, they can do it in such an amazing way. On January 6th, there are parades in the street. There is music and dancing and all manner of celebration. And on that day, there is another gift exchange. All through the day, you find the 3 wise men and their camels making their way up and down the streets of San Juan, meeting the people. The tradition is that every child builds a small wooden box filled with dirt and plants some grass seed on it so that they have something for the camels to graze on as the wise men make their way through town. It's a wonderful tradition. And as much as that tradition, and as I said, the French-Canadian tradition where I grew up, take this as another day for giving of ourselves, I think that the original gospel writer here intended a lot more in the arrival of the wise men than an injunction to give. You see, there's a very stark contrast that's built into this story. Where the wise men go first is to the palace of King Herod. We find that Herod hasn't a clue what's going on. Herod calls together his religious advisors from the temple. They can go to their books and they can see what's supposed to go on, but they're still clueless to the fact that God is moving in the world. And yet, we find these foreigners. And not simply foreigners, but stargazers. And all through the Old Testament scriptures, there are injunctions against things like astrology. God is speaking. The temple, the palace, they don't get it. But these foreigners, these stargazers, are able to hear God's voice loud and clear. And they're prepared to follow that voice where it leads. Consider this in the context of Matthew's community, where they have recently been ejected from the synagogue, where there has been a clear break happening with their Jewish past. They are still a thoroughly Jewish community, but they no longer have that connection to their history. And Matthew points out to them that may not always be a bad thing. God moves beyond the places where the great and the good of the synagogue or the temple are even able to see. And that's an amazing bit of news. In the United Church hymnal, there's a hymn that I came across once. I wasn't overly fond of the tune, but the first line has always come back to me as I approach the Feast of Epiphany. And that line is, God's love colors outside the lines. Now, I have 4 young nieces and nephews. Alice, if you give her a piece to color, will labor over it, being oh so careful, and her art is always absolutely beautiful. Theo, on the other hand, loves to color. But in his exuberance, in his passion, color just goes everywhere. Theo just loves to color, but he colors outside the lines. I think that is an important part of what Matthew wants his community to see in their context, and what I think Matthew would want our community to see in our own context. Christianity has always been a religion of innovation. Whenever we move forward, we begin to entrench where we are, and then God calls us to look on the other side of the lines, to see those that are still being excluded, those who are felt to be beyond the love of God. And then God gently and lovingly pushes us to get outside the lines, to go and share love in those places that previously we couldn't think of. I think that's exactly what Matthew wants us to hear in the story of the wise men. I also think it connects back to what I said about the 5 hidden women, the foreign women with questionable histories. Matthew, in his incarnation, just like all the other Gospels, is going to tell us what he's going to tell us. And the backbone of Matthew's message is that God is not going to be closed in by our human biases and bigotry. God's love is always going to be bigger than we could ever understand. That's amazing news. And it draws me to look at one last piece of that Christmas story, the story of Candlemas and the presentation in the temple. Simeon, the prophet, who has waited in the temple to see the Messiah, finally gets his opportunity to hold that child in his arms. And he is so overcome with joy that he has to sing. And what are the words that he sings? And you'll excuse me if I quote them in the words I learned them in from the Book of Common Prayer. Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared before the face of all people, to be a light to lighten the Gentiles, and to be the glory of your people Israel. A light to lighten the Gentiles. A call to get outside of our own biases and to bring that love to everyone that we meet. I know that we aren't always fond of change. I know we often find it rather scary. But following this God of ours is going to challenge us to keep doing that. I love in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia how Aslan, the Christ figure in that story, is always said by the people of Narnia to be not a tame lion. Our God is not tame, and Matthew wants us to hear that clearly. Our God is going to go into places that we may not ever expect. And he's going to call us as the church to follow along. And thanks be to God, because that is our Advent hope today. Thanks for joining me today. Please join me again on Monday when we're going to begin to look at Luke's story of the Incarnation. Have a great day, and God bless.